Welcome back to Impactful Teamwork. Today, I want to talk about something that sits right at the heart of sustainable performance, and that is this. How do you build a team that does not just perform, but improves over time? Not a team that has one good quarter, not a team that pulls off one heroic push and gets that amazing project over the line, and not a team that only works when you are there in the room. What I'm talking about today is a team that keeps learning, keeps adapting, and keeps strengthening and keeps getting better. So, this podcast has been inspired by a fascinating article I've been reading in the Harvard Business Review by Ron Friedman, and it's called How to Build a Super Team That Keeps Getting Better. And what it explores is how the best teams do things differently. And the research drew on data from over 6,000 knowledge workers across different industries and identified what Friedman calls super teams by looking at what teams rated 10 out of 10 for both effectiveness and a comparative performance in their industry. And what the research showed was that super teams shared three distinct strengths. And these three strengths are: one, they manage time and energy and attention more efficiently than other teams. The second is they make one another look and feel better. And third, they keep building skills and improving over time. And it's this last point I really want to dig in today. Because in my world, this is what teamship is all about. It's not about static success. It's not about command and control. And it's not about squeezing people harder. It's about creating conditions where trust, energy, and curiosity combine to generate momentum. And that is the essence of my Unbridled Teamship roadmap, where game-changing trust, impactful contribution, and unbridled adaptability work together to move teams from a silo mentality and minimal effort towards seamless unity, purposeful alignment, and radical reinvention. And if we look to nature, this makes absolutely perfect sense. Because if I look at my herd of horses, a healthy herd of horses is never static. It keeps responding, it learns, it adapts, it pays attention. It does not survive because one horse shouts the loudest. It survives because the herd stays connected, responsive, and aware. So what I thought today on the podcast I'd do is I'd walk you through 7 practical steps from Friedman's article. And then I'll translate these into real world steps that you can take to build what I'm now calling a superpowered team. So what's the first thing we want to do? The first thing that Friedman suggests is we run more experiments. And this practice is simple, but it's not easy. And some of you will perhaps recall a couple of podcasts ago, I actually run a podcast called Reward the Try, which is all about the concept of how do we create enough psychological safety to encourage team members to experiment. And so what Friedman found in his research was that these super teams experiment nearly 50% times more than average teams. And they don't stop when they find something that works. They keep testing, learning, and adjusting. And the research also notes that leaders of super teams are 3 times more likely to reward intelligent risk-taking. Even when the results fall short, and compared to average teams, super teams are 30% more open to trying new things and 39% more comfortable taking risks. And I think this is really, really important that these teams are more open to trying new things and more comfortable taking risks, because many teams that I look at and talk to are trying to look polished instead of trying to get better. They want certainty before movement, they want guarantees before action, and they want the whole map before they take the first step. But the thing is, momentum doesn't work that way. Momentum comes from motion. Learning comes from testing, and adaptability comes from trying. So what does this mean for in your business? In your business, this might mean testing a new meeting rhythm, trialing a different decision-making process, piloting a new customer touch point, or giving a team member ownership of a stretch point for, say, something like 30 days. As we've said previously on other podcasts, you don't want to make this experimentation dramatic. We don't want to do something that is going to cause the business to fail. We just want to making these small experiments something normal that we do. And this is exactly why one of the accelerators of the Unbridled Teamship roadmap is called Reward the Try. Because if people only feel safe when they get it right, they stop taking these type of intelligent risks. And we need to take the intelligent risks to get improvement. So it's really, really important that we're always getting our teams to feel safe enough to adopt this mindset of continual reinvention, as because that's part of the unbridled adaptability pillar of the Unbridled Teamship roadmap. So the second thing I want to suggest you want to do is to make curiosity contagious. And Friedman found in his research that leaders of super teams are 33% more likely to admit when they lack important information, and 56% more likely to ask thoughtful questions, and 53% more likely to show a genuine interest in learning from other team members. And we know that when we've got psychological safety, this is the strongest predictor of team performance. And that comes from Project Aristotle that Google actually undertook in 2012 when they studied 180 teams. And what they discovered was the teams that had the highest level of psychological safety were the teams that were more inclined to experiment and try things differently. So why does curiosity matter? It matters because curiosity isn't just a personality trait, it's actually a leadership behavior. Because when we engage with curiosity, it says, I don't have to know everything. We can learn from anyone. Questions matter as much as answers, and learning is a team sport. And what I know from the horse herds is that awareness is absolutely imperative for their survival. Horses pay attention, they read the environment, they notice the subtle shifts before the big movement happens. And actually, great teams do the same. They're very fluid, they don't become rigid, they stay awake. So I just want you to ask yourself, when was the last time as a leader you said, I don't know? When was the last time you asked somebody more junior, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And when was the last time your team felt that curiosity was valued more than certainty? Because when curiosity dies, defensiveness grows. And when defensiveness grows, momentum slows. So what is the third thing that I'd like you to embrace? The third practice is really powerful because it cuts through performance theatre. And the question is, what are you stuck on? So I'd like you to start thinking about asking questions that most leaders avoid. Most leaders wouldn't ask the question, what are you stuck on? But actually, Friedman found that super team leaders are 43% more likely to guide discussions towards problems that need solving. And this is real gold because actually, when we get everyone thinking about what needs solving, we get everyone really, really thinking laterally about the problems, what's blocking their progress, what can they do to make things better. Because one of the things I do observe in organizations is so many of the meetings, and we know that we're in meeting overwhelm, they're quite trite, aren't they? They're full of polished updates, and there's very, very little truth spoken in that. Everyone sounds busy, everyone sounds like they're on track, everyone says they're fine. But meanwhile, the hidden blockers are staying hidden. And that's not teamwork. Let's be very, very clear. That's not teamwork. When you're trying to hide what is impairing your performance, that's not teamwork. That's actually performance. So if we want a superpowered team, we're going to need to normalize that friction before it becomes failure. So why don't you try this in your next team meeting? Why don't you ask questions like, what are you stuck on? Where's the work slowing down? What decisions are you waiting for? What conversations are we avoiding? What is harder than it should be? And you cannot build trust by pretending everything is smooth. Trust grows when people can tell the truth without being punished for it. This is why healthy curiosity moves teams from compliance to candor. And it's also why we start making the invisible visible, because we actually are brave enough to ask the questions that nobody else is asking. The fourth practice I'd like you to think about is rolling up your sleeves even when you don't have to. So what do I mean by this? In the research, Friedman argues that the best leaders stay close enough to the work so that they can model the standards they expect, they can see the roadblocks, and they can identify improvement opportunities. But there's a very, very important distinction here between involvement and micromanagement. Strong leaders work shoulder to shoulder with their teams to build capacity, while micromanagers hover and take over. And perhaps many of you can relate to that. I think many of us have worked for that micromanager who just interferes all the time. And as a result of that, you don't feel empowered. And actually, the article in the Harvard Business Research talks about when managers work shoulder to shoulder and alongside their teams, the teams feel more energized and effective. Whereas if the manager almost abdicates responsibility and becomes very distant, that actually creates more stress and exhaustion for the team members. So there's such an important nuance here, because staying connected to the work is not the same as controlling the work. So let me say that again. Staying connected to the work is not the same as controlling the work. And we see this in a healthy herd of horses. Leadership's not detached. It's responsive, it's aware, it's in the relationship with what's happening. And I think a lot of leaders have been taught that they need to step back and give their team the reins, and that's absolutely true. But it's not the case of stepping back as in the frame of abdication. Because sometimes stepping back creates drift. Sometimes it creates confusion. Sometimes it signals disinterest. So the question isn't, am I involved? The question is actually, how am I involved? And are you building capacity or are you creating dependency? And that's really, really important for us as a leader to think about. The fifth practice is really important. It's about making feedback feel like support. So Friedman found that on super teams, more than 90% of workers say that their leaders give feedback that is motivating without sounding critical. And he also cites a review of more than 600 studies showing that feedback makes performance worse in more than a third of cases when it's delivered badly. So I'll say that again. Feedback makes performance worse in more than 33% of times when it's delivered badly. So what does that mean? It means that mistakes, experiments that don't work need to be framed as useful data on the path to improvement. And this is really important because feedback is one of the places where trust either deepens or it dies. Because when bad feedback occurs, it feels like judgment, embarrassment, scorekeeping, correction from the boss. Whereas good feedback feels like belief, support, clarity, and investment in someone's growth. And the article actually talks a little bit about Adobe and the fact that they actually replaced annual reviews with shorter informal check-ins, which saved over 80,000 work hours and reduced voluntary turnover by 34% and increased the percentage of team members who said feedback helped them perform. So this is why we're seeing a lot of companies move from the annual review, which doesn't really work, to this much more continual dynamic feedback throughout the year. Because feedback's not soft, it's actually very smart. And if feedback only happens when something goes wrong, the team's really going to dread it, right? But if you integrate feedback into the daily workplaces, it becomes part of the rhythm of improvement, and your teams can use this as fuel. And again, the horse metaphor is really important here because I know that my horses respond to energy in real time. They don't wait for the equivalent of an annual appraisal to give feedback. The feedback is immediate, clear, and honest. And this is one reason why experiential learning lands so deeply, because it's in the moment. And, I just think about the other day, some of you know that I have a new horse coach, Eden, who's joined the herd. And he actually met the horses for the first time just over the weekend. And, you know, my mare Thistle was really not impressed that Eden was now in the same field of them. But she didn't wait to give him feedback. She was very, very clear on her feedback in the moment. And it was a bit hairy for a while as the two of them, got into this big fight, kicking and screaming at each other. But they all gave their feedback. It was over and dusted. And within about 15 minutes, we had peace and tranquility back in the field. And we haven't had any other issues with that happening. So they've both said their piece, and now they've got on and they now know they need to work together. And I think this is the difference between the horse herds. They give this immediate feedback and then they just get on and go back to grazing. And yet in the workplace, we see people failing to give feedback. People get frustrated and angry and annoyed at colleagues about what they're doing, but they never express it. So you can't deal with the issue. And this is why it's so important that we move from workplaces that encourage this compliance to a place of congruence where everyone says what's happening. The sixth practice I'd love you to think about is how do we encourage growth within the business, even when it doesn't benefit us directly? Because one of the things that Friedman talks about in his article is that side pursuits can actually increase engagement for team members because they become motivated by challenge and mastery. And he also found that workers on super teams were more likely to feel their leaders supported their growth even when that growth had no immediate payoff in the organization. So what he's talking about is people here having what you might call a side hustle, some other interest outside of work. And that when people are engaged and motivated in that, that has a ripple effect back into the workplace. And they also discovered that workers on super teams were twice as likely to feel supported after announcing their departure and 3 times more likely to stay in touch with their manager after leaving. So we know that team members will move on. That is just a natural course of life. But how amazing that if you're on this super team, you feel supported when you announce you're departing and moving on to pastures new. But even better, you're more likely to stay in touch with your manager. Now, that person could go away, learn some new skills, and then be able to come back. That is really, really mature leadership, isn't it? Because insecure leaders, they hoard the talent. They don't want the talent to leave. And yet wise leaders grow the talent. We let our people flourish, even if it's beyond the narrow boundaries of their current role and something changes. And what does that happens? It means that your team members trust you more, they bring more energy, they stretch further, they stay engaged with you while they are with you. So a superpowered team is not built by clipping wings, it's built by creating an environment where people become more of who they are. And I certainly know this to be true. When I was growing my business division within Arthur Andersen and Deloitte, I typically had a 2-year span of team members working for me as data analysts. And it was just at a point after 2 years, they pretty much learned everything in the role. And at the time, the business unit wasn't big enough for me to have any positions for them to move to. So I had to let them leave my research and development team. And they actually then often transitioned into our consultancy team. So that was exactly an example of me helping those people grow their talent, and they continue to benefit the organization. But what was amazing for me was that many of those people eventually went on to go back into industry and work in their own hotel chains. And as a result of that, they then brought work back to me. So we created a real circle of support, which was really, really amazing. And the seventh practice I'd like you to suggest is lead with meaning, not just metrics. So it's really important that people understand why their work matters, what the purpose is, what the end game is, and how they contribute to it, because this brings more energy, collaboration, and people take more pride in the results. And again, Friedman's research found that leaders of super teams were 59% more effective than average team leaders in helping people understand why what they were doing was important. 59% more effective. So, there's a lot of practices we can use to help our team members understand how they contribute. One of the tools that I use is the GC Index, which helps people understand their energy for impact. And if you'd like to explore that with your teams, just reach out to me. But I think this is where so many teams get stuck, because team members don't understand how they contribute to the bigger picture. They know their targets, they know their KPIs, they know their deadlines, but they've kind of lost the deeper thread. What's the purpose of the business? And when that happens, work tends to start feeling very transactional, very mechanical, very flat. Because meaning is what turns activity into contribution. Meaning is what makes effort feel worthwhile. And meaning is what helps people keep going when the numbers wobble and the pressure rises, right? And purpose is absolutely fundamental, I believe, in any business. Grab the reins in our Unbridled Teamship roadmap is the whole pillar about what is the purpose, where is the business going? And if any of you have read my book, Unbridled Business, you know that I describe their purpose as foundational, alongside glue, which is the lubricant that enables this aligned performance to happen. So a team without meaning may produce results for a while, but a team with meaning will keep growing. So let me just give you some quick practical steps that you can use to create a superpowered team. Step 1, create one experiment a week. So pick one thing your team can test for 7 to 14 days. Keep it small, keep it visible, review what you've learned. Step 2, model curiosity at the top. Ask better questions, admit what you don't know, invite challenge. Step 3, change one meeting question. Instead of saying any updates, ask, what are you stuck on? Step 4, get closer to the work, not to control it, but to understand it. Be present enough to spot friction before it becomes failure. Step 5, make feedback lighter and more frequent. More truth, less judgment, more support. Step 6, back people's growth. Give somebody a stretch opportunity, support learning that might not have an immediate return on investment, and trust that that growth travels and creates a ripple impact throughout the business. Step 7, reconnect the team to meaning. Don't just talk about what needs doing, talk about why it matters. What's the purpose? So if you're listening to this today and thinking, yes, my team's good, but they're not really getting better, then perhaps this is your invitation, not to push harder, not to create more pressure, not to demand more effort from people that were already stretched in the business, but to build the conditions where improvement becomes natural, where experimentation feels safe, where curiosity is welcomed, where blockers can be named, where leaders stay connected, where feedback fuels learning, where growth is supported, and where meaning is alive. This is how you build a superpowered team, not by force, but by design. And if you want to explore where your team is right now and what might be slowing down trust, contribution, or adaptability, then I'd love you to take my Turbocharge Your Team quiz. You can find that at businesshorsepower.com/quiz. And it's designed to help you see where your team sits right now and where your next best move is. Because my broader Unbridled Teamship framework is built around helping teams create more trust, more contribution, more adaptability, so that they can move forward towards a more turbocharged future and create a superpowered team. So thanks so much for tuning in again to this week's edition of Impactful Teamwork. And until next time, remember this: great teams don't happen by accident. They're grown one honest shift at a time.